Active duty forces have decreased slightly for FY 2022, but long-term force structure is still undetermined. Retired Marine Colonel Mark Cancian is a senior advisor in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mark, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.
What is force structure and how is it determined?
Sure. The force structure is the size and composition of military forces. And these are things like Army brigades, Navy ships, Air Force squadrons. It's determined during the Pentagon's periodic defense reviews, one of which is going on now for the Biden administration.
You say that, quote, for strategic and budgetary reasons, force structure is staring into the abyss. What do you mean by that?
Many strategists would cut force structure in order to save money to invest in advanced technologies and expensive technologies to confront China. You see some of that in the FY 2022 budget, where the Navy retires 10 ships early and the Air Force proposes retiring 200 aircraft. I think we'll see more of that in the next defense strategy and the FY 2023 budget, which will come out in February. I think you're going to see very deep cuts in force structure.
But, I mean, you mentioned the reliance on advanced technology. So we're talking about robotics, AI, unmanned vehicles. Doesn't that allow the Defense Department to reduce the number of forces? I mean, you don't need as many people.
You don't need as many people for a conflict with China, for example. Although I would point out that even unmanned systems require a lot of people. They just aren't on the battlefield. Very often they're back in the United States or in some remote location. The problem is the rest of the world. Russia, Iran, North Korea are still showing malign intent in confronting the United States. Further, the United States has forces deployed all around the world for humanitarian assistance, for crisis response, and to support partners and allies. Those demands have not gone down despite the efforts of many administrations. So the United States can't ignore those demand on its forces in order to focus exclusively on China.
So what are the challenges then? What's the problem with the administration's proposed approach?
The problem is that if you make deep cuts to force structure, you're going to leave some of these other commitments uncovered and create vulnerabilities. So that if fully implemented, I think you're going to see a lot of pushback from allies and partners. This is going to be a particular problem for the Biden administration, which has argued that the United States is back. It's told our allies and partners that we will be with them, that we will not be pulling away the way the Trump administration had.
So then what about the reliance on reserve forces? Because I believe they're stretched already thin.
Well, they are. The United States has increasingly depended on reserve forces since the early 1970s with the end of the draft and the announcement of what was called the total force policy. The United States has made major investments in training and equipping its reserve forces, and as a result has some of the best reserve forces in the world. Those are able to offset some commitments. Reserve forces, of course, are less expensive, but they're also less ready. Many strategists want to have forces that are rapidly deployable, that can respond quickly to crises and prevent what they call fait accompli. So there's a strategic debate going on inside the Pentagon. Should we rely more on reserve forces, which are less expensive, or should we rely less because they are less ready?
So is the solution here, when there's a gap between military resources and strategy and foreign policy, to scale back expectations, to change that strategy?
In theory, that's what you should do. The problem is it's very hard to dial back strategy. It's very hard to go, for example, to our European allies and say, we're going to scale back our exercises in Europe. We're going to turn more of NATO's commitments over to you Europeans. When we've tried that in the past, of course, there's been a lot of pushback. So this resources strategy gap opens up. And you've seen that in the Congress, for example, that there's been a push to increase funding for defense. The Biden administration and the Trump administration before it had proposed level funding. 3 of the 4 congressional committees have proposed increases of about $24 billion to try to close that gap.
Is this challenge, Mark, across all the services, or is one worse off than the others?
All of the services face these challenges. They're facing them differently, however. You look at the Army, for example, many strategists would cut the size of the Army to invest money in air and naval capabilities. The Army preserved its force structure in the FY22 budget, and it did this by cutting readiness and modernization. It's making a strong argument around town about its relevance to modern conflicts, particularly in China. Its officials have blanketed the think tanks, for example. The Navy's in a different position. There's a bipartisan consensus to expand the size of the Navy. The challenge with the Navy has been that the administration is retiring ships as fast as new construction arrives, so it's hard to expand the size of the Navy in those circumstances. Its long-term plans include smaller ships and many unmanned vessels, consistent with the recommendations of many strategists, including those in the Trump administration.
All right, well, Mark, we'll watch how this develops. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the show.